It is 3:40 in the morning on August 31st, 1888. You are walking through the streets of Whitechapel in the East End of London. The fog is thick, the gaslight dim, and the cobblestones slick with something you'd rather not identify. You are a woman, and you are alone. You shouldn't be out at this hour. Respectable women aren't, but respectability is a luxury you cannot afford. You need fourpence for a bed in the doss house, and the only way you know to get it involves the dark alleys and darker transactions of the night. So you walk, and you look for customers, and you try not to think about the dangers. There are many dangers in Whitechapel. The gangs who run the streets, the pimps who beat their girls, the customers who refuse to pay, or worse. Disease, hunger, cold, despair. Death comes easily here, and it comes often. But tonight, there is a new danger in Whitechapel. A danger that walks like a man, speaks like a man, perhaps even dresses like a gentleman. A danger that will make this autumn the most terrifying in London's history. His name. The name the newspapers will give him is Jack the Ripper. And he is hunting. Welcome to Whitechapel, 1888. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss another journey into historical darkness. And if you're already subscribed, you know the drill. Leave a like on this video. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It helps more than you know. And honestly, the women of Whitechapel could have used someone paying attention to. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. The fog, the streets, and the monster walking among us. The Jack the Ripper murders of 1888 are the most famous unsolved crimes in history. In the space of 10 weeks, at least 5 women were brutally killed in the Whitechapel district of London's East End. The killer was never caught, never identified, never brought to justice. He vanished into the fog from which he had emerged, leaving behind only bodies, terror, and an endless parade of theories. But the Ripper story is about more than murder. It is about Victorian London at its most desperate: the poverty, the prostitution, the disease, the indifference of the wealthy to the suffering of the poor. It is about a society that created the conditions in which such murders could happen, and then expressed shock that they did. It is about the women who died not just as victims, but as people, with histories and families and dreams that were stolen from them. Over the next few hours, we're going to explore Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888, the streets where the murders happened, the women who died, the investigation that failed, the suspects who were never charged, and the legacy of terror that echoes to this day. This is the brutal reality of Jack the Ripper's London. Get comfortable. The fog is rolling in. To understand the Ripper murders, you must first understand Whitechapel, a place so desperate, so dangerous, so utterly abandoned by respectable society that it was known as the Abyss. The East End of London in 1888 was the dark mirror of the glittering West End. While the wealthy strolled through Hyde Park and attended balls in Mayfair, less than 5 miles away, hundreds of thousands of people lived in conditions that shocked even hardened social reformers. Whitechapel was the worst of the worst, a square mile of misery that concentrated every social ill of all. Victorian England. The streets were narrow, crooked, and filthy. Open sewers ran down the middle of many roads. Buildings that had been constructed as single-family homes now housed dozens of families. Each room subdivided and subdivided again until people lived in spaces barely large enough to lie down. The rookeries, the worst slums, were mazes of alleys and courts where sunlight never reached and the police rarely ventured. The population was a mixture of the desperate and the displaced. Irish immigrants who had fled the famine, Jewish refugees escaping pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, English men and women who had fallen from respectability through drink, illness, or simple bad luck. They competed for scarce jobs, scarce housing, and scarce food. Many did not survive the competition. The statistics were staggering. In 1888, approximately 1,200 prostitutes worked the streets of Whitechapel, and that was just the registered estimate. The true number was certainly higher. Thousands more lived in common lodging houses, paying fourpence a night for a bed, often shared in dormitories where disease spread like fire. The average life expectancy in the East End was decades shorter than in the West End, just miles away. This was the world that created Jack the Ripper's victims. And this was the world that created Jack the Ripper. The women who would become the Ripper's victims were not abstractions. They were not simply prostitutes or unfortunates, as Victorian euphemism would have it. They were people with names, histories, families, and lives that had led them through various paths of misfortune to the streets of Whitechapel. Prostitution in Victorian London was not a profession chosen freely. It was survival. The alternatives for a woman without family support, without education, without respectable employment were stark. The workhouse, starvation, or the streets. Many women moved in and out of prostitution, depending on their circumstances, working legitimate jobs when they could find them, selling their bodies when they couldn't. The work was dangerous in countless ways. Violence from customers was common and rarely prosecuted. Disease, syphilis, gonorrhea, and countless other infections was endemic. Pregnancy was an occupational hazard that could end a woman's earning ability. Alcohol, which many women used to endure the work, created its own spiral of dependency and degradation. The women worked the streets because they had nowhere else to go. The common lodging houses required payment every night, fourpence for a single bed, eightpence for a double. A woman who couldn't pay was turned out, regardless of the hour, regardless of the weather. So they walked the streets until they earned enough for a bed, or until exhaustion or drink brought them down in whatever doorway they could find. The 5 women who would become the canonical 5. Ripper victims Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were all in their 40s, except Kelly, who was in her mid-20s. All had known better times. All had fallen through alcoholism, failed marriages, or simple misfortune into the abyss of Whitechapel. They did not deserve what happened to them. No one does. If you're enjoying this journey into Victorian darkness, take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and I promise the horror is just beginning. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, was 43 years old in August 1888. She had been born. Mary Ann Walker in London had married William Nichols at 19 and had borne him 5 children. The marriage had failed. William blamed her drinking. She blamed his affairs, and they had separated in 1880. Without her husband's support, Polly had drifted downward through the layers of Victorian poverty. She had tried to stay respectable. She had worked as a domestic servant in various households, but drink kept pulling her back to the streets. By 1888, she was living in common lodging houses in Whitechapel, earning her bed money through prostitution when she could, sleeping rough when she couldn't. On the night of August 30th, 1888, Polly was drinking at the Frying Pan pub on Brick Lane. She had been turned away from her lodging house earlier. She didn't have the fourpence for a bed and had gone out to earn it. At 2:30 a.m., she told a friend she had earned her DOS money 3 times that night, but had drunk it away each time. She was heading out again, she said, confident she would earn it back. "See what a jolly bonnet I've got now," she said, showing off a new black bonnet she was wearing at approximately 3:40 a.m. on August 31st. A carter named Charles Cross discovered a body lying in the gateway of a stable yard on Bucks Row. He thought at first it was a tarpaulin or a pile of clothes. Then he saw it was a woman, her skirts pushed up, her eyes staring at nothing. Polly Nichols's throat had been cut so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. Her abdomen had been slashed open. The Whitechapel murders had begun. The discovery of Mary Ann Nichols's body set in motion one of the most intensive police investigations in Victorian history, an investigation that would ultimately fail to identify the killer. The Metropolitan Police, under Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, took the case. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, who had spent years working in Whitechapel and knew its streets intimately, was brought in from Scotland Yard to lead the investigation. Aberline was experienced, dedicated, and thorough. He would work the case for years. The initial investigation focused on the obvious suspects, the men who might have been Polly's last customer. Witnesses were sought, though few people in Whitechapel were eager to talk to police. The lodging houses were canvassed. Known violent criminals were interviewed, but the killer had left almost nothing behind. No weapon, number clear footprints, no witnesses who had seen the attack itself. The police were hampered by the conditions of Whitechapel itself. The dark streets, the maze-like alleys, the uncooperative population all made investigation difficult, and the sheer number of potential suspects was overwhelming. In a district where violence against women was commonplace, where hundreds of men might have been wandering the streets at 3:40 a.m., narrowing down the possibilities was nearly impossible. The press covered Polly's murder with interest, but not alarm. Violence against women in Whitechapel was common enough that a single murder, even a brutal one, did not immediately signal something unusual. The police treated it as they treated similar cases, as a tragedy, as a crime to be solved if possible, but not as the beginning of something far worse. That would change with the next murder. If you're settling in for the night, now's a good time to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment, because we're about to meet the Ripper's second victim. Annie Chapman was 47 years old, though she looked older. Like Polly Nichols, she had known better times. She had been born Eliza Ann Smith, had married John Chapman, a coachman, in 1869, and had lived a respectable working-class life for over a decade. They had 3 children. One, a son, was disabled. The marriage had ended sometime in the 1880s again. Drink was blamed. Annie had drifted to the lodging houses of the East End, supporting herself through crochet work, selling flowers, and prostitution. She was known as Dark Annie for her wavy dark hair. Friends described her as clever and well-spoken, despite her circumstances. By September 1888, Annie was in poor health. She had been involved in a fight with another woman shortly before her death and bore the bruises. She may have been suffering from tuberculosis or another chronic illness. She was, by any measure, in the final stages of the descent that Whitechapel imposed on those who fell into its grip. On the night of September 7, 1888, Annie left her lodging house without the money for a bed. "Don't let the bed," she told the keeper. "I'll be back soon." She never returned. At approximately 6 a.m. on September 8th, John Davis, a resident of 29 Hanbury Street, stepped into the backyard of his building and found Annie Chapman's body. Her throat had been cut. Her abdomen had been torn open, her intestines pulled out and placed over her shoulder. Her uterus had been removed and taken away. The Ripper had returned. And this time, the horror was impossible to ignore. Annie Chapman's murder transformed the Whitechapel killings from a local crime story into a national sensation. The newspapers, and there were many in 1888, had found a story that would sell millions of copies. The Victorian press was a wild, competitive arena. Dozens of newspapers fought for readers, and sensational crime stories were guaranteed sellers. The Chapman murder had everything the papers could want: sex, violence, mystery, and a killer on the loose. Headlines screamed about the Whitechapel fiend and the leather apron, an early suspect, who was soon cleared. The coverage was detailed, graphic, and relentless. Readers across Britain learned about the wounds inflicted on Annie Chapman, about the organs that had been removed, about the dark streets of Whitechapel where such horrors could happen. The papers ran diagrams of the crime scenes, interviews with witnesses, and speculation about the killer's identity and motives. The public response was panic, at least in the East End. Women who had no choice but to work the streets did so in groups when they could, watching for strangers, starting at shadows. Men who fit the vague description of the leather apron were attacked by mobs. Suspicious behavior of any kind could lead to a beating or arrest. The police were overwhelmed. Tips poured in hundreds, then thousands from people who thought they knew who the Ripper was. Each had to be investigated. Meanwhile, the press criticized the police for their failure to catch the killer. Adding to the pressure on an already strained investigation, London had entered what the newspapers would call the Autumn of Terror, and the worst was yet to come. On September 27, 1888, the Central News Agency received a letter that would give the killer his enduring name. The letter was addressed, "Dear Boss," and signed Jack the Ripper. The letter taunted the police and promised more murders. "I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled," it read. The writer mocked the idea that he wore a leather apron, a reference to an early suspect, and promised to send the police the ears of his next victim. The letter was written in red ink with a dramatic flourish. Was it genuine? Opinions have differed for over a century. Some investigators believed it was the authentic voice of the killer. Others thought it was a hoax, perhaps, created by a journalist seeking to increase the story's sensation. Modern analysts have reached no consensus. What is certain is that the letter gave the killer his name. Jack the Ripper caught the public imagination in a way that the Whitechapel murderer or the leather apron had not. It was catchy, memorable, terrifying. The newspapers ran with it, and the name stuck. The letter was followed by a postcard received on October 1st. That referenced the double event, two murders that had occurred on September 30. The timing suggested the postcard's author had inside knowledge of the crimes. But it could also have been sent after news of the murders became public. The Dear Boss letter created the Ripper as a personality, a figure who communicated, who taunted, who seemed to enjoy the attention. Whether that personality was the actual killer or a creation of the press, it defined how the world would remember the Whitechapel murders for generations to come. If you're still with me in the fog of Whitechapel, take a moment to hit subscribe. Your support helps me create more historical deep dives. And speaking of doubling down, let's discuss the night the Ripper struck twice. September 30th, 1888, a date that would be burned into the memory of London. In the space of less than an hour, 2 women were murdered within a few hundred yards of each other. The double event raised the terror to new heights. Elizabeth Stride was found first, at approximately 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street. She was 44 years old, born in Sweden, and had lived a difficult life that had brought her to Whitechapel. Her throat had been cut, but unlike the previous victims, her body had not been mutilated. The theory is that the killer was interrupted a witness named Louis. Dean Schutz drove his pony and cart into the yard and may have disturbed the Ripper before he could complete his work. Frustrated, perhaps enraged, the killer moved on. Less than an hour later, and less than a mile away, he found Catherine Eddowes. Catherine was 46 years old, a woman who had traveled to London from Wolverhampton years before and had fallen into the same pattern of drink and desperation as the other victims. She had been released from police custody just minutes before her death. She had been picked up for drunk and disorderly conduct and held until she was sober enough to walk home. Her body was found at 1:44 a.m. in Mitre Square, within the City of London, a different jurisdiction from Whitechapel. Her throat had been cut. Her abdomen had been torn open, her intestines pulled out and placed over her shoulder. Her face had been mutilated, her nose cut off, and her kidney removed and taken away. The Ripper had killed twice in one night, and he had left a message. Near Mitre Square, police found a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron, bloody and discarded in a doorway on Goulston Street. Above it, written in chalk on the wall, was a message. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. The message has been debated ever since. Was it written by the killer? Was it a coincidence anti-Semitic graffiti, common in an area with a large Jewish population, and the apron merely dropped nearby? If it was the Ripper's work, what did it mean? The misspelling of Jews as Jews has spawned theories connecting the murders to Freemasonry, to Jewish mysticism, to dozens of esoteric explanations. What happened next has been even more controversial. Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren ordered the message erased before it could be photographed. He feared that leaving it visible would incite anti-Jewish riots in the volatile atmosphere of the East End. The decision was made quickly, in the early hours of the morning, and the message was wiped away before dawn. Warren has been criticized for this decision ever since. The message might have been evidence handwriting that could have been compared, phrasing that could have been analyzed. By erasing it, Warren destroyed potentially crucial information. But he made the decision under pressure, in a district on the edge of violence, with a large Jewish population that had already been targeted by mobs seeking the leather apron. The Goulston Street graffito remains one of the great mysteries of the case. Was it the Ripper's confession? A red herring? An unrelated piece of anti-Semitism? We will never know for certain. If you're settling in for sleep, subscribe and leave a comment about what historical topic you'd like me to cover next. Because now we're about to receive a package from hell. On October 16, 1888, George Lusk, chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a citizens group formed to patrol the streets and assist police, received a small cardboard box in the mail. Inside was half a human kidney, preserved in alcohol. The accompanying letter was different from the Dear Boss letter. It was written in a crude, uneven hand, with irregular spelling and grammar. It was addressed from hell and signed, "Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." The letter claimed the kidney came from Catherine Eddowes, whose kidney had been removed during her murder, and that the writer had fried and ate the other half. It was very nice, the letter said. Was the kidney genuine? Dr. Thomas Openshaw, who examined it, believed it was a human kidney, probably from a woman around 45 years old, and preserved in spirits. He could not determine whether it was Catherine Eddowes specifically. Other medical opinions varied. The From Hell letter is now considered by many researchers to be more likely genuine than the Dear Boss letter. Its crude handwriting and spelling suggest a less sophisticated author than the newspaper-worthy Dear Boss correspondent. If it was genuine, it provides the only potential physical evidence from the killer and reveals a mind that had descended into something beyond ordinary criminality. George Lusk was horrified. He had received, in the mail, a piece of a murdered woman's body, accompanied by a letter claiming the sender had eaten the rest. The autumn of terror had reached a new depth. Mary Jane Kelly was different from the other victims. She was younger, probably in her mid-20s, though her exact age is uncertain. She was attractive by the accounts of those who knew her, and she had her own room, a small, dingy space at 13 Miller's Court, off Dorset Street, rather than sleeping in common lodging houses. Kelly had come to London from Ireland by way of Wales. She claimed to have worked at a high-class brothel in the West End before descending to Whitechapel. Whether this was true or a romanticized version of her past is unknown. What is known is that by November 1888, she was working the streets of Whitechapel, behind on her rent, and drinking heavily. On the night of November 8, 1888, Kelly was seen bringing a man back to her room at approximately 2 a.m. Several witnesses heard a cry of murder around 4 a.m., but such cries were common in Whitechapel and went uninvestigated. Kelly's body was not discovered until 10:45 a.m. on November 9th, when her landlord's assistant came to collect the overdue rent. What he saw through the window was so horrifying that he ran to find his employer rather than enter the room. When police finally broke down the door, they found a scene that would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. Mary Jane Kelly had been virtually destroyed. Her face had been mutilated beyond recognition. Her body had been opened and her organs removed and arranged around the room. Her heart had been cut out and was never found. The attack had been so extensive that the killer must have spent hours at his work. The Ripper had found a private space, with time and solitude, and had revealed the full extent of his madness. The photographs taken at Miller's Court are the only surviving crime scene images from the Ripper investigation. They show the horror in clinical detail, and they are almost unbearable to look at. Mary Jane Kelly lay on her bed, which was positioned against the wall nearest the window. Her body had been positioned on its back, her legs spread. Mutilations were so extensive that the police report lists them in cold, clinical detail over several pages. Her face had been hacked and slashed until it was unrecognizable. Her breasts had been removed. Her abdomen had been opened and emptied. Her thighs had been stripped of flesh. Internal organs had been placed around the room, on the bedside table, under her head, between her feet. Her heart was missing. The room itself was small, barely larger than a closet, with a bed, a table, and a chair as its only furnishings. A fire had been burning in the grate, so intensely that it had melted a kettle spout. Police theorized that the Ripper had used the fire for light while he worked, and possibly to burn some evidence. Perhaps blood-stained clothing? The attack was estimated to have taken at least 2 hours. The killer had had privacy, time, and the opportunity to do whatever he wished. And what he wished was annihilation, the complete destruction of another human being. The Kelly murder was the last of the canonical five, the five murders, generally agreed to be the work of Jack the Ripper. Whether the Ripper killed before or after these five is debated. But Kelly was the climax, the culmination, the point where the killer's compulsion reached its fullest expression. If you're still listening, subscribe and leave a comment. Because now we need to discuss who Jack the Ripper might have been, a question that has never been definitively answered. Over the past 135 years, hundreds of suspects have been proposed. Some were named during the original investigation. Others have been identified through later research. Still others are clearly fantasy proposals based on thin evidence and wishful thinking. The truth is that we do not know who Jack the Ripper was, and we probably never will. The police at the time had their own prime suspects. Sir Melville Macnaghten, who joined the Metropolitan Police in 1889, named 3 in a memorandum. Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher who committed suicide shortly after the Kelly murder. Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born con man with a history of mental illness. And Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant who was committed to an asylum. Of these, Kosminski has received the most modern attention. Witness testimony allegedly placed him near one of the murder scenes, and some researchers have claimed DNA evidence links him to the crimes, though these claims are disputed. His mental illness and the timing of his institutionalization fit the pattern of the killings. But dozens of other suspects have been proposed. Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, the artist Walter Sickert, the doctor Sir William Gull, the slaughterman Joseph Barnett, who was Kelly's former boyfriend, and many more. Each theory has its advocates and its problems. The truth is that the Ripper killed in darkness, left little evidence, and was never identified. He is a mirror in which we see our own fears and fascinations reflected. The search for his identity tells us as much about ourselves as it does about him. The investigation into the Ripper murders was by any measure a failure. The killer was never caught, never identified, never brought to justice. Why did Victorian policing fail so completely? The Metropolitan Police in 1888 were not equipped for this kind of investigation. Criminal forensics was in its infancy. Fingerprinting would not be used in Britain until 1901. Blood typing did not exist. Photography was limited. The tools that modern investigators take for granted simply were not available. The police relied on witnesses, but witnesses in Whitechapel were unreliable. Many were drunk, many were frightened, and many had their own reasons to avoid talking to police. The descriptions of suspicious men seen near, The murder sites varied wildly and were often contradictory. The police also struggled with jurisdiction. The Metropolitan Police covered Whitechapel, but the City of London Police a separate force covered Mitre Square, where Catherine Eddowes was killed. The two forces did not always cooperate smoothly, and the division may have allowed the killer to escape between them. And the police were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of tips, accusations, and false confessions. Thousands of letters poured into Scotland Yard, each claiming to know who the Ripper was. Each had to be evaluated, and many led investigators. Down blind alleys dot the failure to catch. The Ripper damaged public confidence in the police and contributed to Commissioner Warren's resignation in November 1888. It also led to reforms in policing, better coordination between forces, improved investigative techniques, and a recognition that some crimes required more sophisticated approaches than Victorian methods could provide. If you're settling in for sleep, subscribe and leave a comment. Because now we need to ask, why did the murders stop? After Mary Jane Kelly's murder on November 9, 1888, the Ripper killings ceased. At least the canonical killings did. There were later murders in Whitechapel that some have attributed to the Ripper, but none matched the pattern of the 5 generally agreed upon victims. Several theories explain the cessation. The most common is that the killer died. Montague Druitt's suicide in December 1888 has been cited as evidence that he was the Ripper, ending his own life after the Kelly murder. Other suspects also died or were institutionalized around this time. Another theory is that the killer emigrated. Some researchers have tried to link the Ripper to murders in other countries in the United States, in Germany, in various parts of the British Empire. The evidence for these connections is generally weak, but the possibility cannot be ruled out. A third theory is that the killer was imprisoned for another crime. Victorian prisons were full of violent men, and many would not have been recognized as the Ripper. If the killer was imprisoned for an unrelated offense, his identity might have been hidden within the general population of criminals. Or perhaps the Kelly murder was the end the Ripper sought. Some serial killers reach a point of climax where their compulsion is finally satisfied, at least temporarily. Kelly was the most extreme murder, the most complete destruction. Perhaps it was enough. Whatever the reason, the Autumn of Terror ended. But its legacy was just beginning. We have discussed the 5 women individually, but it is worth pausing to consider them together, to remember that they were not merely victims, but people. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. 5 women ranging in age from their mid-20s to their late 40s. 5 women who had known better lives and had fallen through alcoholism, failed marriages, or simple bad luck into the desperate world of Whitechapel prostitution. They were mothers between them. They had at least a dozen children, most of whom survived them. They had been wives, though all of their marriages had failed. They had been daughters, sisters, friends. They had names, faces, personalities. They laughed, they cried. They hoped for better days that never came. The Ripper reduced them to victims, to objects, to symbols of Victorian vice. The press often treated them with contempt, emphasizing their alcoholism and prostitution, as if these facts somehow mitigated their murders. Even today, discussions of the Ripper tend to focus on the killer rather than the killed. But they deserve to be remembered as people. They did not choose to be murdered. They did not deserve what happened to them. They were human beings who found themselves in impossible circumstances and did what they had to do to survive until survival was no longer an option. Their names should not be forgotten. Polly, Annie, Liz, Kate, Mary Jane. They were the Ripper's victims. But they were also so much more to understand the Ripper's victims. We must understand the world that created them, the world of Victorian prostitution. The Victorians had a complicated relationship with prostitution. Officially, it was condemned as a moral evil. In practice, it was tolerated as a necessary outlet for male. Desire a safety valve that protected respectable women from the lusts of men who could not or would not. Varied out the estimates of the number of prostitutes in Victorian London vary wildly from 8,000 to 80,000 depending on how the term was defined. Many women move in and out of prostitution depending on their circumstances. A woman might work in a factory or as a servant when she could find such work, and sell her body when she couldn't. The line between prostitute and woman who sometimes sold sex was blurry. The legal situation was equally complicated. Prostitution itself was not illegal, but almost everything surrounding it was. Soliciting, keeping a brothel, living off the earnings of a prostitute, all were crimes. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s allowed police to forcibly examine women suspected of prostitution for venereal disease, essentially criminalizing being female in certain neighborhoods. The women at the bottom of this world, the street prostitutes of Whitechapel, had almost no protection. They were vulnerable to violence from customers, pimps, and random strangers. They were vulnerable to disease, exposure, and starvation. They were treated with contempt by respectable society and indifference by the law. The Ripper's victims came from this world. They did not choose it freely. They were pushed into it by a society that offered women few alternatives and punished them for the alternatives they found. If you're still with me in Victorian London, take a moment to hit subscribe. Your support helps me create more historical deep dives. And speaking of creating monsters, let's discuss how the press shaped the Ripper legend. The Jack the Ripper story was, in many ways, a media creation. The newspapers of 1888 were not merely reporting on the murders, they were shaping how the public understood them. And in the process, they created the Ripper as a cultural figure. The Victorian press was fiercely competitive. Dozens of newspapers fought for readers, and sensational crime stories sold papers. The Ripper murders had everything the press could want: sex, violence, mystery, and a terrifying unknown killer. The papers covered every detail, speculated wildly, and fanned the flames of public panic. The coverage was often irresponsible. Newspapers published graphic descriptions of the victims' injuries that would never appear in modern media. They named suspects who had not been charged, ruining reputations and sometimes inciting mob violence. They invented details when real information was lacking. The Dear Boss letter, which gave the killer his name, may have been a journalistic hoax. Some historians believe it was created by a journalist at the Central News Agency to increase the story's sensation. If so, the press literally invented Jack the Ripper, not the killer, who was real, but the personality, the taunting voice, the name that would echo for over a century. The press also shaped the investigation. Police were under enormous pressure to produce results, and they sometimes made decisions based on public relations rather than detective work. The failure to catch the killer was a failure the newspapers loudly publicized. contributing to the resignation of Commissioner Warren. The Ripper was real, but the legend of the Ripper, the name, the personality, the enduring cultural fascination, was created by the newspapers of 1888. The Ripper murders had an unintended consequence. They brought the horrors of East End poverty to national attention. Before 1888, the respectable classes of London could ignore Whitechapel. It was a different world, a few miles away, but utterly separated from the lives of the middle and upper classes. The poor were invisible, their suffering unreported, their lives unexamined. The murders changed that. Suddenly, journalists and readers were confronting the reality of Whitechapel, the overcrowded lodging houses, the desperate women, the violence and squalor. They were everyday facts of life. The question arose, how could such conditions exist in the heart of the world's greatest city? Social reformers seized the opportunity. Organizations like the Salvation Army increased their presence in the East End. Journalists like W.T. Stead used the murders to argue for social reform, drawing connections between poverty and vice, between neglect and violence. The Ripper had killed 5 women, but the conditions that created his victims were killing thousands more, slowly and invisibly. The reforms that followed were gradual and incomplete. Housing conditions improved somewhat. Charitable organizations expanded their work. But the fundamental inequalities of Victorian society remained, and the East End would continue to be a place of poverty and desperation for decades to come. Still, the Ripper murders forced a moment of reckoning. They made visible what had been invisible. They demanded that respectable society confront its own complicity in creating the world that produced both victim and killer. If you're settling in for sleep, subscribe and leave a comment. Because now we need to explore the endless theories about the Ripper's identity. The Jack, the Ripper case is the most theorized about crime in history. Hundreds of books have been written proposing solutions. Dozens of documentaries have been produced. The theories range from plausible to absurd. From carefully researched to obviously delusional. The royal conspiracy theory is perhaps the most famous. It proposes that Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, was somehow involved in the murders, either as the killer himself or as the reason for a cover-up. The theory has been thoroughly debunked. Albert Victor was documented elsewhere during several of the murders, but it persists because it combines 2 of the public's favorite topics, royalty and murder. The mad doctor theory proposes that the Ripper was a physician, based on claims that the mutilations showed anatomical knowledge. This theory has produced suspects like Sir William Gall, physician to the Queen, and Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack arrested in London in 1888. The medical evidence, however, is disputed. Many experts believe the mutilations show no particular surgical skill. The local land theory proposes that the Ripper was someone who lived in Whitechapel, knew its streets intimately, and could blend in with the local population. Suspects like Aaron Kosminski and Joseph Barnett fit this profile. This theory is perhaps the most plausible, but it lacks definitive evidence. And then there are the fringe theories that the Ripper was a woman, a collective, a supernatural entity. These theories tell us more about human imagination than about historical reality. The Ripper murders changed how society thought about crime and how crime was investigated. Before 1888, the concept of a serial killer did not exist. Crimes were understood as individual acts committed for individual reasons. The idea that someone might kill strangers repeatedly, compulsively, without apparent motive, was not part of the public consciousness. The Ripper changed that. The pattern of the murder's similar victims, similar methods, clustered in time and space suggested something new. A killer who killed not for money, not for revenge, not for any rational reason, but because killing was what he needed to do. The term serial killer would not be coined until the 1970s, but the concept was born in Whitechapel. The investigation also influenced future policing. The failures of 1888, the jurisdictional conflicts, the lack of forensic evidence, the overwhelming volume of tips led to reforms. Future investigations would benefit from better coordination, more sophisticated techniques, and a greater understanding of criminal psychology. And the media coverage established a template that persists today. The sensational crime story, with its focus on the killer rather than the victims, its speculative theories, its feeding of public fear, all of this was pioneered in the Ripper coverage. The true crime genre, which dominates modern media, has its roots in the newspapers of 1888. The Ripper was never caught, but his crimes shaped the world that came after. The study of the Jack the Ripper case has become its own field, with its own name, Ripperology. And Ripperologists are a dedicated, passionate, sometimes obsessive community. The serious study of the case began in the 1950s and 60s, when researchers started examining the primary source's police files, newspaper accounts, inquest testimony with fresh eyes. Books like Donald, Rumblow's The Complete Jack the Ripper, and Philip Sugden's The Complete History of Jack the Ripper established standards for responsible research. But Ripperology also has its fringe. Every few years, someone announces they have solved the case, usually with evidence that does not withstand scrutiny. DNA evidence has been claimed multiple times, but each claim has been disputed by other experts. The case seems to invite confident declarations of certainty that the evidence cannot support that the internet has transformed Ripperology. Online forums allow researchers to share documents, debate theories, and collaborate across continents. Websites host vast archives of primary sources. But the internet has also enabled conspiracy theories, hoaxes, and arguments that would never survive peer review. The appeal of Ripperology is understandable. The case is genuinely mysterious. The killer was never caught, and the evidence allows for multiple interpretations. The setting is evocative Victorian London, with its fog and gaslight, its class divisions and hidden horrors. And the crimes themselves are horrific enough to demand explanation, to demand that someone be held accountable. But the victims deserve better than to be reduced to clues in a puzzle. Ripperology at its best remembers the humanity of the women who died. At its worst, it treats them as props in a game. If you're still listening, subscribe and leave a comment. Because now we need to visit modern Whitechapel and see what remains of the Ripper's hunting ground. The Whitechapel of 2024 is utterly different from the Whitechapel of 1888. The slums have been demolished. The rookeries have been replaced by tower blocks and offices. The narrow streets have been widened, the dark alleys lit. Some locations survive. The 10 Bells pub, where several of the victims drank, still stands on Commercial Street. Christchurch Spitalfields, which overlooked the murder sites, still dominates the skyline. A few streets maintain their original names. Dorset Street, where Mary Jane Kelly died, is now Duval Street, but the street itself survives. But most of the Ripper's Whitechapel is gone. Bucks Row, where Polly Nichols was found, is now Durward Street, lined with modern buildings. Hanbury Street, where Annie Chapman died, has been largely rebuilt. Miller's Court, the scene of the Kelly murder, was demolished entirely. A parking lot occupies the site. Walking tours offer to show visitors the Ripper's London, and thousands take them each year. The tours are controversial. Some see them as exploitation of tragedy, others as legitimate historical education. The tour guides vary in quality, from knowledgeable historians to purveyors of sensational nonsense. The Ripper haunts Whitechapel still not as a ghost, but as a story, a brand, a cultural phenomenon. The area that was once synonymous with poverty and violence is now one of the most rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods in London. The fog has lifted, but the shadow remains. Why does Jack the Ripper remain so famous, so fascinating, more than a century after the murders? Partly, it is the mystery. The killer was never caught, never identified, never explained. This gap in knowledge invites speculation, theory, imagination. We can project onto the Ripper whatever fears and fascinations we carry. He is a blank screen on which we see ourselves reflected. Partly, it is the setting. Victorian London is endlessly evocative. The fog, the gaslight, the class divisions, the barely concealed horror beneath the surface of respectable society. The Ripper seems to embody something about the era, the violence hidden beneath propriety, the darkness at the heart of empire. Not partly, it is the nature of the crimes. The Ripper's murders were not merely killings but desecrations. The mutilation suggested a mind that had gone beyond ordinary criminality into something more frightening, pure destruction for its own sake. The Ripper became the archetype of the motiveless killer, the monster who kills because killing is what he is. And partly, it is the victims. The women of Whitechapel were the most vulnerable members of Victorian society, poor, female, scorned. Their deaths exposed the hypocrisy of a society that condemned prostitution while creating the conditions that made it necessary. The Ripper murders were not just crimes against individuals. They were indictments of an entire social order. We remember the Ripper because he holds a mirror to us, showing us what we fear, what we deny, what we prefer not to see, that we end where we should have begun, with the women who died. Mary Ann Nichols, born 1845, mother of 5, killed August 31st, 1888. Annie Chapman, born 1841, mother of 3, killed September 8th, 1888. Elizabeth Stride, born 1843, immigrant from Sweden, killed September 30th, 1888. Catherine Eddowes, born 1842, mother of 3, killed September 30th, 1888. Mary Jane Kelly, born circa 1863, the youngest victim, killed November 9th, 1888. These women were not symbols. They were not clues. They were not characters in a mystery story to be solved. They were human beings who lived, loved, suffered, and died in ways that no one should die. They were failed by their families, who could not or would not support them. They were failed by a society that offered women few opportunities and punished them for taking the opportunities they could find. They were failed by a legal system infatuated them as nuisances rather than citizens. And they were failed by a police force that could not catch their killer. The fascination with Jack the Ripper has always focused on the wrong person. The killer, whoever he was a pathetic creature, driven by compulsions he probably did not understand. The victims were the interesting ones. Women who fought to survive in impossible circumstances, who maintained their humanity in conditions designed to strip it away. We do not know who killed them. We probably never will. But we can remember who they were. Polly, Annie, Liz, Kate, Mary Jane. They deserved better than they got. May they rest in peace, Dot. And so our journey through Whitechapel comes to an end. The fog has lifted. Not just the physical fog of Victorian London, but the metaphorical fog of time and legend that has obscured the truth about those autumn weeks in 1888. What remains is simpler and sadder than my mystery stories suggest. 5 women died. They died because they were poor, because they were female, because they had fallen into circumstances that left them vulnerable to a predator who stalked the streets they could not avoid. They died in darkness, in pain, in fear, and their killer walked away into the fog and was never seen again. We do not know who he was. The theories will continue, the books, the documentaries, the confident claims of solution. But the truth is that the Ripper's identity died with him, probably more than a century ago. He was not a prince, not a famous artist, not a brilliant surgeon. He was probably nobody special, a local man, perhaps mentally ill, perhaps driven by compulsions no one understood. He killed, and then he stopped killing, and then he died. That is all we know. What matters is not who he was, but who they were. Mary Ann Nichols, who showed off her new bonnet just hours before her death. Annie Chapman, who promised to return to her lodging house and never did. Elizabeth Stride, who survived one attack run link to meet another. Catherine Eddowes, released from police custody just minutes before her murder. Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest, whose room became the site of the most horrific crime of all. They were not saints. They drank. They sold their bodies. They made choices that respectable society condemned. But they were human beings, and they deserved to live. They deserved justice that never came. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, consider the streets of Whitechapel. Not the romantic Whitechapel of legend, the fog, the gaslight, the mysterious stranger in the top hat, but the real Whitechapel of 1888. The overcrowded lodging houses, the desperate women walking the streets for fourpence, the violence that was an everyday fact of life long before the Ripper came. Consider that the Ripper was not an aberration, but an extreme expression of something ordinary. The violence that Victorian society inflicted on its most vulnerable members, slowly and invisibly, every single day. The Ripper killed 5 women in 10 weeks. Poverty, disease, and neglect killed thousands more year after year, with no headlines and no investigation. The Ripper is famous because he killed dramatically. But the society that created Whitechapel killed quietly, and its crimes were never punished at all. Rest well tonight. Rest in a world that has changed since 1888, where women have more options, where poverty is less lethal, where the dark alleys have mostly been lit. The progress is real, even if it is incomplete. But remember the women who did not get to see that progress. Remember Polly, Annie, Liz, Kate, Mary Jane. Remember that they were people, not symbols. Remember that they deserved better. The fog has lifted, but we should not forget what it hid.